So, what if the entire foundation of modern marriage isn't actually based on the Bible, but on, of all things, Roman law? Today, we're unpacking a really controversial argument for polygyny. It's sourced from a detailed interview that challenges, well, just about everything you might think you know about marriage, feminism, and religious history. Let's dive in.
Okay, so why is this topic such a hot button? I mean, just mentioning it can cause a pretty intense reaction. According to the source we're looking at, it's because our modern ideas about marriage, which it argues come from ancient Roman law, are on a direct collision course with what it calls clear biblical precedent.
All right, first things first, let's get our terms straight. We are specifically talking about polygyny. That's one man having more than one wife. This is a really key definition to keep in your head because the source material focuses completely on this specific form of marriage. So here's our roadmap for unpacking this argument. We're going to start by looking at why this is such an emotionally charged topic. Then we'll dive into the case for polygyny in the Bible itself. After that, we'll explore how the source claims man's law took over, get into a pretty surprising spiritual dimension involving something called Ashtaroth, and finally, we'll look at the massive damage this perspective claims has been done.
So let's dig right into that central conflict. According to the source, this isn't just some casual debate about different lifestyles. No, this is framed as a fundamental clash between what it calls God's original law and the man-made doctrines that came later.
Now, this slide gets the absolute core of the historical claim. The source is asserting that the whole one-man, one-woman rule isn't rooted in Scripture at all. Instead, it argues that the early church just adopted it, borrowed it directly from Roman law, basically to make Christianity a little more palatable to the Roman public.
Okay, so where's the proof for all this? Well, now we turn to the primary evidence the source uses to back this up. And it says this evidence comes straight out of the Old Testament, from the lives of its most revered figures. And we're talking about the heavy hitters here, people like Abraham, Jacob, and King David, men who are described as righteous, as deeply blessed by God, and they all had multiple wives. The argument then poses this really powerful question. If God blessed these men and their families, how could their type of marriage possibly be a sin? And the source uses this quote to really add some serious weight to that point. The suggestion here is that, from a biblical perspective, criticizing the patriarchs for their family structures isn't just being disrespectful. It could actually be a pretty dangerous thing to do. This brings us to a really crucial distinction the source makes, the difference between prohibition and regulation. It points to a law in Exodus that actually lays out a husband's duties to his first wife if he decides to take a second. The logic presented is pretty straightforward. Why would God make rules for how to do something if he didn't accept it as a legitimate practice in the first place? Okay, so if this was the biblical practice, you gotta ask, how did everything change so drastically? This next section gets into the historical turning points where, according to this source, man-made laws started to push out what came before.
And this timeline, according to the source, kind of maps out that shift. It starts way back around 1020 CE with the ruling in Judaism, but interestingly, that only applied to Ashkenazi Jews. Then you fast forward to the Protestant Reformation in the 1540s. Apparently, Martin Luther couldn't find any scriptural reason to forbid polygyny, but he ended up waffling under public pressure. The final nail in the coffin, as it's presented here, came in 1563 at the Council of Trent, when the Catholic Church made it official and condemned the practice.
And this timeline is a huge part of the source's argument. The fact that it took the church over 1,500 years to formally declare polygyny a sin is presented as powerful evidence. The point they're making is that this prohibition wasn't some original Christian teaching, but a slow, gradual, man-made change.
All right, so we've covered the history. And now the argument takes a turn. We're moving from historical claims into a more abstract spiritual dimension. The source actually connects the monogamy-only doctrine to something it calls the spirit of Ashtoreth.
So, what in the world is the spirit of Ashtaroth? Well, in this context, it's described as the spiritual influence of a pagan goddess, and her goal, according to the source, is to flip the biblical authority structure completely on its head. The source even goes so far as to call it the spiritual engine that drives modern feminism.
So here, the source lays out what it sees as two competing models. On one hand, you have what it defines as the biblical structure, a clear hierarchy of God, then the Messiah, then man, and then woman. But in contrast, it claims the Ashtaroth structure just inverts those last two, placing the woman's authority over the man's.
And here's how the source claims this abstract spiritual idea actually shows up in the real world.
This quote suggests that a couple's immediate gut reaction to the topic of polygyny is like a litmus test. It supposedly reveals in just a few seconds which of those two authority structures is really running their household. Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, now we get to the fallout. This final section outlines the real-world societal consequences that the source attributes directly to this centuries-long prohibition of polygyny.
So what's the total damage assessment from this doctrine, according to the source? The answer is stark and incredibly simple: incalculable. The argument is that the negative effects are so widespread and they run so deep that it's actually impossible to fully measure them.
And here are some of those specific consequences the source alleges. It claims the monogamy-only rule forces people into a corner, divorce or secret affairs. It says it leaves millions of women single and vulnerable, especially after major wars. It even destroys careers and ministries over relationships that, in this view, aren't actually sinful. It also claims it inverts family authority and creates this really unique system it calls marriage socialism.
So let's break that down because it's a pretty interesting term. What exactly is marriage socialism? The source frames the biblical model as kind of a free market, where women can choose from the highest quality men available. In stark contrast, it portrays our current system as a kind of socialism, a system designed to make sure every man gets one woman, completely regardless of his quality or ability to lead.
And that brings us right back to where we started, with a really challenging question. If, and it's a big if, but if the historical, scriptural, and spiritual claims presented in this source are correct, what does that imply about the very foundation of our modern families and our society? It's a provocative idea for sure, and one that definitely makes you think a little deeper about why we believe what we believe.